Hello, students. Today we will be discussing Vedic religion, Vedic literature, Vedic history, all things Vedic. As a little side note to get started, the root Veda usually means truth or knowledge. It comes from the root vid, which means to know, but can also mean to find and to see, from the same root as we have video. So that's a fun thing. And with the Vedas, there are 4 Vedic sanitas, or collections. That's the Rig Veda, which is a selection of hymns, the Yajurveda, a selection of ritual and sacrificial procedures, Samaveda, which describes the melodies for how to sing those very hymns, and the Atharvaveda, which has secret material, magic, and royal material. Now, you don't have to write those down real quick because we're going to have them in the video over and over again when I get to the PowerPoint. So without further ado, let us get to our PowerPoint experience for the day. Here we go. Always takes me a second. I know. Now here we go. All right, let me get this into presentation mode and we are ready to rock and roll. Yes, so what do we see as we wait for all these things to happen? Do we see the truth? Do we see Veda? Have you heard of that beauty institute called Ayurveda? You know, Indians tend to look at it and say, Ayurveda, that's like, no, that's like, it is like non-truth. It is like naive. So, I guess I have subtitles turned on. Well, that's interesting. We'll see how that works today. All right, so as we get going. So they did what? Veda, Vedas, and the Vedic. So what is the term Vedic and how is it an adjective? Well, Veda means just the types of literature that are found in the earliest forms of Sanskrit and Hindu thought, of which we have 3 sanitas, or collections. We have the Rig Veda, which is a collection of hymns. You have the Yajurveda, which is a collection of sacrificial and ritual ideas or substitutions or ritual procedures. The Samaveda, which tells you how to chant the Rig Veda, that is made up of these little hymns that are called riches, which becomes, that's RC, so Rik. And the Atharvaveda, which is filled up with magic and dangerous rites and rites for royal consecration. So these are some of the oldest texts. They are arguably older than Hebrew or Mesopotamian texts. But for something to be truly Vedic, it would have to be from these scriptures. It would have to be found in these actual, mostly ritual texts. Vedic is now an adjective. So when people say Vedic, they mean something is really old, something is really traditional, something is really orthodox. So in that light, here's 2 uses of Veda that are a little confusing. You have Ayurveda, Ayur from Ayus, which means life. So the science of life, which is Ayurveda, which is about, as we described before, balancing these internal, what they call gunas or qualities, which is sattva, which is purity, rajas, which is action, and tamas, which is sort of torpitude. So it's balancing those things into Ayurveda. So here we see a woman having crazy oils dumped on her head. You don't find this in the Vedas anywhere. On the right, we see a bunch of guys who are white guys, and we call them Hare Krishnas. They are from ISKCON, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. Intriguingly, ISKCON is now actually getting big in India amongst Indians, but for the most part, when it was started in the 60s and 70s, it was an Indian guru who came to the United States and had a whole lot of mostly Western men who followed and became monks. They call their entire culture of ISKCON to be Vedic, even though it has nothing to do with any, in particular, Vedic scriptures per se, but they would say Vedism is living a balanced, traditional Hindu, vegetarian lifestyle of chastity and whatnot. As we'll see in this class, there's a fair amount of meat eating and non-chastity going on in the Vedas. So these are some of the oldest texts we have in existence. And in fact, their authority comes from their age, not their content. As we'll see, their contents are kind of archaic rituals and hard to understand hymns. Arguably, they're older than Hebrew and Mesopotamian culture, but people debate on that. We could say that they start being systematized about 1500 BCE, but they could be even earlier than that. The language is in an archaic form of Sanskrit that a lot of us like to call Old Indo-Iranian, because what happens is, you know, the earliest people in Iran start heading to the east, while some of them head to the west on their chariots, and ones that head to the east head to India. And if you look at the earliest forms of Iranian writing in the Avestan, you'll actually see that there's a lot of cognates to Sanskrit. So while the culture of the Vedas is very much Indian and starts out in the Punjab in the northwest of India, all our geographic markers are from there. It has these contiguities with old Iranian culture of these types of sacrifices, worship of fire, and the chariot cultures. They were a culture on the move on their chariots. And even within the Vedic rituals, you see a lot of chariot races. And how do you have a ritual or how do you have a chariot race in a ritual space? Well, with quite a bit of danger, my friends. So one distinction I wanted to make here is Shruti versus Smriti. Now, Shruti means that which is heard. Smriti, you can think of as that which was said, that which was written down. Smriti actually means that which was remembered. The Vedas are thought to be Shruti. They are what is heard. They are Alpurushaya. They are personless. They were not written by anyone. They weren't written by the gods. They weren't written by men. They were these characters named seers or rishis, and they were able to tune in and hear the Vedas that are constantly reverberating around the universe. And as my first kind of guru told me, it's like you got a radio. And if you tune into it, you can hear the Vedas. They're always going on, which is kind of a nice way to think of it. So Smriti, these are literally literature. Smritis are that which is written down. The epics, the Puranas, anything that you read that's sort of in Sanskrit will be considered Smriti. So Shruti, revealed, but more seen and heard. Smriti, that which is sort of human in its authorship. So all of these texts are ritual texts. The Rig Veda has just all of these hymns, what are called riches. The Ayurveda explains how you use those hymns and do rituals around using those hymns. So explaining how to build the giant brick bird or how to sacrifice the horse. That's all in the Ayurveda. It also does the explanations of if you can't find this ingredient, like say Soma, which no one could ever find, then you can use this other thing. So it'll have all these substitutions to do the rituals. And you have the Samaveda, which gives you the melodies for how to chant the Rig Vedas. Finally, the Atharva Veda, which is secret and dangerous stuff, magic, things to do with royalty and ways to support a king. So the woman we're reading today, who's the most important reader, is a woman named Wendy Doniger. She's a somewhat controversial author. She's written a bunch of structural stuff in the 60s and 70s, in particular a book called Shiva the Erotic Ascetic, in which she does psychoanalytic readings of Hindu myths. These days, she still uses psychoanalysis, but she interprets everything from rings in Sanskrit rituals around the world, symbolism of rings. I heard her on the radio describing what's called the bed trick, or which is, I think, most famously found in Revenge of the Nerds, where the woman goes to bed with a guy she thinks is her boyfriend, but under the mask, aha! It's the nerd from Revenge of the Nerds, the bed trick. So she tracks out some of these sort of ideas throughout cultures, but she's an expert in Sanskrit literature. In fact, she's in my parampara. Now, the word parampara means this and then that. So my guru, my PhD advisor, was a man named David White, and Wendy Doniger was his PhD advisor. So she's in my lineage. And she's a lively writer, as you could tell. She's really enjoyable to read. Her book, The Hindus, An Alternate History, is wonderful. It's about a history of Hinduism, but it keeps an eye to outcasts, animals, and women. And it's a lively, big, fat read. It came out in India to great praise. Then 2 or 3 years later, the Hindu nationalist fundamentalists finally got around to reading it, and they panned it. They tried to get it banned, but it didn't work. And it's enjoying wide reading again. So over the 10 years that it's been out, I think it's become a classic. All right, so the Vedas are old stuff. So they were oral in composition. They remained oral after being introduced. So these texts, even after there were a lot of other texts being written down, these were still chanted. So Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, Atharva Veda, there would be people that would memorize them, and they would memorize them in intricate detail, and then they would have recitation contests. And so we can actually find that people to this day who have these texts memorized, you can put one guy from North India and one guy from South India, and they can chant it, and they will have them exact same memorized. The Rig Veda was the first Veda, and that's a set of hymns, mostly around the god Indra, who's the great hero. It's organized into 10 mandalas, or chapters. That was written first, we can guess maybe 2500 BCE, but it gets codified around 1500 BCE. And we have the Samaveda and the Yajurveda, which were written around the same time. And then the last one was the Atharva Veda. But what I want you to remember is And these are oral texts. They were recited. They weren't written down and composed as sort of later texts like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata that are like the Sanskrit Iliad and the Odyssey. So there are three gods that are primary. There are more gods in Vedic religion, but they're not the gods that we see later. I mean, these aren't your Shiva and your Vishnu and you do see Brahma a little bit. But our three main gods I want to look at here are Indra, Agni, and Soma. Indra rides the elephant. He's actually found in Thailand as well these days. But anyway, Indra is like a hero. He's like the great hero who bears a lightning bolt or a rainbow. He also brings the rain and has the power over storms. Doniger makes a joke that he reigns and he reigns, which is not a bad joke. Agni. Now, Agni is fire. It's found in all fires, but he's a god in himself. He rides this buffalo because he conveys things from the earth to the skies. He conveys all the oblations to the heavens and to the gods. Now, the intriguing thing about him, as we're going to see in Vedic rituals, you don't have any images, but you do have fire. There are three fires in all Vedic rituals. You have your sacrificial fire, your domestic fire, and then you have another fire that's used kind of in between them. So the fires are essential, and they are actually not only an image of God, but they are God in himself. As I think I mentioned before, my friend Ranj always says that every time she goes to a birthday party, she gets a little freaked out. She's a South Indian woman, because when people blow on the cake, she can hear her mother yelling at her, "My God, why would you want to spit on Agni?" So also you'll see that with Indians, they'll always snuff out candles. They won't blow them out because Agni is fire. Finally, you have Soma, made so famous by Aldous Huxley when he talks about Soma, which is the drug that they're always taking in A Brave New World. Well, Soma is an intoxicating drink that is pressed or squeezed from the root su. These are sugar canes in the picture, just because we don't know what Soma was. And we actually don't think a lot of the Vedic thinkers knew what it was. They already had substitutions for it in a lot of the rituals, even at the earliest time. A lot of folks say it's cannabis. A lot of folks say it's mushrooms. A lot of folks say it's opium, but none of those really work out when you really try to look at how it's described. All right, so these are ritual texts. They are done by people. They are primarily about chanting and doing specific ritual aims. They're done by Brahmins, as you can see here, some pretty traditional Brahmins. What are these characteristics of these rituals? Well, they have no temples. And temples start about 6th century CE. We're talking about 1500 BCE. No temples until 600 CE. There are no images. You don't see statues of gods. You don't see statues of people. You don't see paintings, nothing. There are no permanent implements. In fact, if you watch a Vedic ritual, you'll see that they actually make like the wooden ladles and the pots out of clay and whatnot. And they make them fresh every time. And then at the end of a big ritual, they destroy them all. Everything is temporary. So what do you see when you go there? Well, you see guests. So guests sitting around. You see the priests who are performing the rituals, and then others making sure they perform the rituals right and supporting them doing all the rituals. And then you have the patrons. So in a big ritual called the Agni Chayana that I'll talk about in a minute, you have this guy called the Yajamana. So he doesn't do anything. Like him and his wife, they sit under under an umbrella for 12 days, but he's given all the funds and the land to do the ritual. He gets all the benefit of the ritual. The priests don't. Now, the guests and the congregants will share in the ritual food. If there's a sacrifice or if there's ritual eating done, they'll share in that. They, to some degree, get some prosperity for having seen the ritual, but all of the great benefit goes to the Yajamana. The priests just kind of do their duty and do get paid by the Yajamana to do it, but all the benefit goes not to the priests, but to the one who has sponsored the ritual. Also, unseen there are the gods. The gods are called by the very ritual invocations that they say to come forth, and they invisibly are there, except for Soma, who is pressed out from the stalks, and Agni, fire, who is present because they're making offerings of him. So the gods are guests, but the only ones you can see are Soma and Agni. So these rites are enacted. They're actually done. They're not visualized. People measure them out and figure out the ritual space, as we're going to see, and have specific implements, and they do the rituals, and they speak the hymns. So the first ritual I want to look at is the Agni Chayana, which is my favorite because there's a giant brick bird. Yes, they do make a giant brick bird. They make they measure it all out. They make all the specific bricks, and they lay out this giant brick bird. So over 12 days, they measure out the space, they build the brick bird, and they do pressings of Soma. Now, like I said, we don't have Soma. So they use ritual substitutes for the Soma. There's also a point where there is an offering of 5 heads, one being human, one being a monkey, one being a buffalo, one being an elephant, I can't remember. But once upon a time, they probably did use actual heads. Now they use like special pots or carved coconut substitutes because, well, you know, sacrificing humans is problematic these days. I don't think humans were ever really often sacrificed, even in the Vedic times, but what greater sacrifice than a human? So describing sacrificing a human makes everything seem that much more potent and powerful. So the sponsor of the Agni China, which means the building up of the fire, gains an immortal body and heaven. So that's the Yajamana, the guy that sponsors everything. Now there's also gift giving. So the sponsor at the end of the ritual, before they burn everything down and smash everything up, gives gifts to the Brahmins, and he gives gifts to guests who are there. So he shows his magnanimousness. Now, the Ashwameda, this is written to a lot. We hear about it in literature. It's problematic. Ashwameda literally means a horse sacrifice. So what goes on here is a king who wants to show his incredible power and to sort of consolidate his power, gets a horse and he lets it wander around. And wherever the horse stops to graze, everybody has to leave the horse alone. And if he stops there, that's the king's land. Often the army will file behind it. So can you imagine you're out there and you're like, hey, there's a horse in my field. You're like, you get out of that field, horse. And the next thing you know, like 100 guys pop and say, hey, what was that? You're like, oh, you're with the king. Here, let me give you some food and drink and whatnot. All right, please don't kill me. So you've got this horse wandering around wherever he shows up. That's the king's place to rule. After 1 year of wandering, the horse is brought back and sacrificed. Now, they don't cut the horse up because the blood from doing that would render wherever they did it, and the people who did it impure. So they strangle the horse. Now, here's the little dirty little part that's often described. And I'm not sure on it, but there's a whole bunch of like body sexual riddles and like sort of like dramatic plays that go on in this. And during one, supposedly the chief of the 4 queens, because every king has a 4 queens, he has his best one, his favorite one, his one who's a bit of a strumpet, he has his 4 queens. The chief queen either mines or actually does copulate with the body of this horse. Now, if you think about the physics of that, it doesn't seem likely. But there's something going on there that is about masculinity and femininity and what it means to be royal. And I can't really figure it out, but it's there. So, all right, so this is, at the end of this ritual, it's like a grand coronation, which everywhere that horse has been, the king is now like this universal emperor of it. Now, Rama from the Ramayana, the hero of the Ramayana, and Krishna and the Pandavas from the Mahabharata, when they get done with their epic strivings and battles, they do horse sacrifices. So, people don't do them now, but there's a whole rhetoric around them. Okay, Agnihotra. Now, people do this all the time still. It's a twice daily offering of milk into fire that Brahmins do. It's done in like less than 15 minutes, but over 100 acts and chants are done during it. They use chants from the Rig Veda. And what is the purpose of this? It ensures that the sun will rise. It will maintain the universe. There's a saying that if a Brahmin somewhere in the world doesn't perform it on one day, it's all over. World's over, sun's not coming back. So Agnihotra, the singing of the fire. Now, Soma pressings. I don't have a picture of Soma because we don't know what it is. Soma is from the Sanskrit root su, which means to press or squeeze. So what happens is you get these long sort of greenish stalks that are described in the text, and they're pressed out, and the juice from that is intoxicating. In fact, the god Indra is an addict. He gets all crazed on it and psychedelic breakdown, does all sorts of crazy stuff regularly. Soma is a visible god. Like I said, we can see it in the ritual. We don't really know what it is. But these Soma pressings, of which there are a number in the Ashwameda and in the Agni China, they're thought to bring about and support the body and the soul and aid the world and bring prosperity. But again, we don't know what Soma is. So, priests and clergy. We're in the halfway part of this lecture. So, usually when I teach this class, I read my translation of the Rig Veda 1090, but I'm just going to limit it to one specific verse here. And this is 1090 verse 12. The Brahmanas are his head. The rulers perform his arms. Those who are Vaishyas get the thighs on him. The Shudras is born of his feet. Now, Rig Veda 1090 is about a sacrifice of this primordial human. And it like cuts him up in different ways to create the whole universe and create ritual and create, you know, even here, the 4 classes of society. Was this a way for people to actually organize a society in the time of the Vedas? I don't think so. But in later times, people have taken this specific verse and used it as justification for the caste system in India. So Brahmins, kings, and patronage. So this is really, I think, the nuts and bolts of the social world of the Vedas. So kings would sponsor agraharas. An agrahara means like an encampment. These would be sort of like little villages with like rice paddy fields and whatnot. And what a king would do is he would say, all right, that village, I'm going to give it to you Brahmins. Now the Brahmins didn't work the land. So what they would do is the people that would work the land would sell their crops and whatnot. And then that would basically generate a tax that would go to the Brahmins. So the kings would sponsor these agraharas in order to sponsor Brahmins and look good for himself. So he would be considered a greater king because he sponsored Brahmins. This is sort of like that soft cultural power. So in a way, these agraharas would generate money that would go to the Brahmins. So when we think about the Brahmins, when people describe the caste system in India, they often say, oh, the Brahmins are the top caste. Well, are they? I mean, they have the most learning in Sanskrit ritual, not necessarily like, I don't know, animal husbandry or military. Those would be the kings, the barons, the landowners, the kshatriyas, or the vaishyas that are the farmers and the people that have all the money. Brahmins sometimes would get in really well with kings and become quite wealthy. Other times they would not. So in the caste system, it's generally the barons, the kshatriyas, and the vaishyas who have the money and the power. Brahmins, if they get in good with them, they do all right. But, you know, Brahmins don't always do well. They don't always do well at all. Some of them are very poor. I remember one friend of mine saying that when he asked his father, who was a Brahmin, why he didn't teach him how to recite the Vedas. And his father said, why did I teach you to be a beggar? So, you know, there's a certain, you think of the Brahmins as having all of this cultural might, but it doesn't necessarily always translate to material might, though often it does, not always. So Brahmins are our priests. When you go to a temple, your priest, especially a big temple, you're going to have a Brahmin who's the priest. So they are ritual specialists. They have maintained the specific diet. They have kept away from impurities. They're in a perfect condition to be able to touch the body of God in the image and touch whatever needs to be done in the temple. They're the only ones that can do that because the rest of us haven't consumed the right foods, maintained the right purity violations, and don't know the material. These Brahmins might not even necessarily know a ton of Sanskrit, but they got it all memorized so they can do the specific services that are required for them as Brahmins in a temple. Now, if you go to these smaller temples with little gods, that might not be the case. You might have an outcast. You might have anyone. You could have anyone that's doing this. If they're not working in Sanskrit and they don't have a high god that requires a level of purity for its technicians, then you could have anybody being that pujari, that one who does puja, one who does worship. Okay, so rural versus urban Brahmins. Now, I'm always thinking of a pal of mine whose mom told me that they were actually Vaidiki Brahmins as opposed to Niyogi Brahmins. Now, this family is from Andhra Pradesh. And they described the Vaidiki Brahmins are the ones like Vaidiki from Vedic or from Veda. These are the ones that live out in the woods. Well, not in the woods, but they live on a plantation. They live in a rural area. They don't interact with kings. They don't interact with, you know, money lenders. They don't interact with moneyed people in any ways. They're just out there. They're somewhat gentleman farmers. They get the revenues from their fields. They do their rituals. That's who they are. Now, the Niyogi Brahmins are different. They're urban. So they hang out with moneyed people. They hang out with kings. In fact, you have, and I do like to call it the Vaidikis somewhat, you know, redneck Brahmins. They often describe themselves as being sort of like country bumpkins that happen to know Sanskrit. But you have Purohitas. That's from Puroda, the one who goes before. The Purohita is the chief priest for a king. Now, he not only maintains the king's body and does the daily rituals he needs to do to maintain his sovereignty and and all of that kingly stuff. But he is also the chief military and magical advisor. So he does the dreadful sorcery to kill the enemies. He also interacts with yogis and fortune tellers and whatnot, so the king doesn't have to, so he can get all the sort of occult might and knowledge he needs to support a military campaign. When armies face each other in battle, the Purohitas of each king would go out first and perform wizard battles beforehand. They could possibly tell maybe who's going to win or who not. Maybe even if the Purohita is really good, could really scare everybody else off, especially if he somehow manages to make ill portents like meteors or earthquakes occur that could drive the other army away. So Purohitas would be these quintessential Niyogi Brahmanas, these urban Brahmanas who interact with the kings. There are another group that gets often described called Vratyas, those who have taken a vow. Now, some people speculate that these characters are proto-tantrikas. What's tantra but sort of hyper-ritualized, heterodox Sanskrit Hinduism. And we're going to talk about tantra quite a bit later. So these were upstart Brahmins. They didn't have any money. So what do? They become Vratyas. They take this vow, and they go out and they live in the woods, and they hang out in bands. They hang out like, I don't know, and what the German word is Mannerbund. I don't know, they're almost like bikers out there. You know, they're on their horses, they run around, and they use coarse language. They're described to live in the wilderness. They're described to take a lot of intoxicants. They're violent and they're impure, but they wander around. They steal other Brahmins' cattle to build up enough of a cattle herd. Remember, the early Brahmins and the early Vedic people were pastoralists. So they would try to get as many cows as they could to get their own upstart capital. They're upstarts. Their startup capital to start their own family and their own cattle herds. One thing, a friend of mine I met who works in Africa in public health, he said that, because I was talking about how much I like Vratyas and cattle rustling and stealing cattle. He said, yeah, well, you know, they like that too, but where I'm from, pretty much anytime somebody comes and steals cattle, they tend to also sexually assault women on their way. And there is this sense with the Vratyas that there is a danger among them. So imagine if you had a whole bunch of, 22-year-old dudes out trying to steal your stuff all the time. But then, once they get enough cows and whatnot, they do what's called the Vratya Stoma, which means which is a Vratya ritual that is explained in the Atharva Veda that describes them as dangerous but also holy and mighty, and reintegrates them into society. So after their time when they were out cattle rustling, they come back and they become prominent Brahmins. So a lot of this gets all messy. Around 500 BCE to 200 CE, there's a challenge to all of this Vedic ritual life and notions of heaven and prosperity and whatnot. So you have the Jains and the Buddhists come forth and say, you ain't getting heaven. There's reincarnation. It's happening over and over and over again. And every time you come back, it's bad. So it's like you die and die again and again and again. It's not like we get to live forever happily in many lives. It's a miserable existence. So the Jains and the Buddhists have this challenge, but so do the Hindus. These Hindus start thinking about an idea of moksha or liberation. The Buddhists have the idea of nirvana. Jains also talk about moksha. So liberation where one does not return, where one is integrated into the totality and is not reborn to an endless cycle of life and death, is not stuck constantly getting old and dying miserably. So this isn't just a challenge that comes from Jains and Buddhists, but it's an overall change in the culture that we'll be reading about when we talk about the foundations of Jainism and Buddhism as we move on to the coming weeks. So today there still are Brahmin groups. There's not a lot. I mean, there's tons of Brahmins. People are caste Brahmins, but people living in traditional Vedic society. There are some in Nepal. There are a fair amount in Kerala in the southwest and in the southeast in Andhra Pradesh. There's a book called Vedic Voices, Intimate Narratives of a Living Andhra Pradesh Tradition by a guy named David Knight, who's a legendary scholar of Hinduism and Sanskrit literature. So these Brahmins in these contemporary places, they kind of keep to themselves. They don't really want to be involved in the modern world. They're not like Amish folk, for instance, but they are secretive and they stay away from what's going down. But they maintain the scriptures, they maintain the resuscitation, and they maintain the recitation, and they maintain the scriptural memorizing, and they do some of the rituals still. So this is not a completely dead culture. And in fact, if you were to watch the video Altar of Fire about the Agni China that's performed in 1975 by the Urban Brahmins in Kerala, it's like, well, this might be the last time this ever happens. But there's been a resurgence. People are wanting to live in this Vedic lifestyle more, and there are people who want to sponsor people living this Vedic lifestyle. So there's a chance maybe the Vedas will live on. Maybe they'll have a whole new life. Maybe we'll have a whole new orthodoxy of people memorizing Sanskrit, and hopefully not, you know, sacrificing horses, but building big brick birds. I'm digging it. I like the idea. All right, onward to more Hinduism. Okay, I'm done, honey. Oh no, that's it. That's for today.